Hello everyone and welcome to this new video about level design. In this episode, we're going to see an essential notion for level creation, which is finding the right pacing and tempo for your level. So whenever you design a new level for your game, it's important to plan ahead the different events and activities you want for your players. These important moments and gameplay segments are the key to defining the rhythm of the scene and crafting a nice game experience. Drafting such a timeline for your level is really important because it will ensure that there is a logical progression that grabs and maintains the player's attention. A core idea for the level creation process is that of the game beat. These are all the super highlights I've marked here that really make the narrative move forward and feel like milestones to the players. These beats are the skeleton of your level, its base structure. So they have to be decided on early on because they will define the shape and flow of your level. Contrary to other notions we've already discussed in this series, this time you shouldn't be too flexible about them. If after working on your level for a few hours you want to replace one beat with another, it probably means that there's something fuzzy or just plain wrong about your level as a whole. Cause when done properly, game beats will determine most of what's on screen. From the story that's told, to the characters that appear, the environments that are shown, the monsters you encounter, and even the game mechanics you're taught. The combination of all these game beats forms the pacing of your level. It's a sort of rhythm curve that specifies the intense, heated phases and the relaxing moments, and that helps you get a bird's eye view of how balanced your tempo is over this entire chunk of the game. Of course, there is no right or wrong answer as for what pacing you should have, and where or what your beats should be. But there are a few common patterns and tricks to remember when designing your level's pacing. First of all, beats may have different roles, and they should have different intensities. Ideally, they won't be all about surprising and stressing the player more and more. And conversely, having just a flat pacing curve is a bit boring. Thus, introducing some variations in your beats can be a great way of keeping the players hooked in. In short, here, downs are just as crucial as peaks. Following up on this idea of variations, it's essential to try and sometimes match and sometimes subvert the player's expectations. Good pacing should offer comforting structures, such as the well-known setup, confrontation, resolution, three-act scenario, but also surprising breaks here and there. If we come back to our idea of the intensity curve, having a straight line like this is better than a flat one, because at least the tempo has some movement, but this movement is too predictable. Even a pattern of ups and downs like this is repetitive and lacks variations. Introducing a new game mechanic, showing an incredible set piece with a memorable event or heavily scripted and unskippable encounter, posing for a nice panorama, having an action-packed scene, discovering a new resting place, fighting a group of enemies, all of these are beats with different intensity levels that should be spread in your level to make an interesting journey for the players. So having a gap between what the player thought was gonna happen and what actually happens can be a neat way of boosting up the intensity and re-grabbing the gamer's attention. With that being said, you should still try to make the pacing of the level increase overall, until the final resolution that concludes this chapter and brings the players home. You'll want to get little variations and surprises, but if you want the players to not be bored in the middle, the levels have to steadily accelerate. It can be about adding new enemy types, facing the player with bigger packs, making more complex environments that allow for more advanced moves and techniques from your opponents, or even just putting a big boss to mark the end of the level. And with the amazing Portal series, we've seen that gradually teaching and then piling up mechanics, sometimes with a little twist, is also a great way to introduce logical and yet very real intensity in your game. This idea of consistently and constantly upping the ante, as creative director Kevin Oxland puts it, is therefore a nice way to overcome the inherently repetitive nature of video games, with their reused game mechanics and copy-pasted assets. For example, in The Binding of Isaac, even if the notion of level is perhaps a bit vague, we obviously have this progressive intensity and difficulty curve, since you start with some easy rooms and then gradually discover more and more enemies and more bosses. Now, assessing and refining your level's difficulty curve is a major topic, and it's definitely worth exploring in its own video, so I'm not going to go into too much details on this here. But this question of meeting or subverting the player's expectations actually brings us to another paramount thing about game beats, which is that they are highly dependent on the type of game you're working on. Typically, an arcade game, a racing game, a puzzle game or an MMO all have specific rhythms, and they rely on different types of events to keep the player's focus. Single-player games that are heavily scripted are, in a sense, the easiest in terms of pacing, because you as a creator have a very strong control over the rhythm and the sequencing of actions. Apart from the player stopping in the middle of the corridor to eat a snack, nothing can really change what's gonna happen, or the order of the events. But multiplayer games are very different, since the pacing mostly comes from the player-to-player interactions. Here, as a game designer, what you can control is mostly the shape of the level, and how this environment will support or hinder certain behaviors from the players. And what about MMOs, or open worlds, where even the notion of level is hard to define? In those games, you don't have scripted corridor action with a clear sequencing of the activities. Rather, you have what's called non-linear pacing. This can be hard to accommodate for from a designer's point of view, because it means that, technically, everything should make sense and be challenging enough no matter the order you choose to visit the locations, which is clearly not easy to set up. This is why some games sidestep this issue by ranking areas with specific difficulties, or dynamically adapting the level of the enemies to the current power of the hero. Still, this last example of the open world shows us that the notion of game beat is not limited to just a basic scene level. Pacing is also a thing for your entire game and for small actions. Typically, your levels should form a logical whole. They should connect together as seamlessly as possible and build upon what you've seen and learned before, in the first levels, to always keep the ball rolling and increase the intensity. To me, the Tomb Raider reboot did that very well, since even though the action is fairly scripted, you don't feel that constrained and you move from one chapter of the story to the next quite naturally. Also, just as a final side note, there's something I read in this article by Peter Ellis that I found particularly interesting about pacing in video games, and how it relates to pacing in movies. Basically, although it's always interesting for game designers to draw inspiration from films, the distinction is once again about the interactive component of the game media, and therefore how players can directly impact the rhythm of the artwork. Contrary to a movie, where events happen in a set timeline, with games you are the one in charge, and you can potentially decide whether the next scene will be about brute force combat and big action, or smooth and stealthy predatoristic infiltration. But anyway, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this quick tips and techniques tutorial about level design, and that you've learned a few things about pacing and game beats, and why they are so important in the level creation process. If you did, feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And of course, don't hesitate to leave a comment with your own ideas for future level design tutorials. As always, thanks a lot for watching, and take care.